Hey everyone, Wanderbot here, and welcome back to another episode of the Cookie Cast. I've gotten some water, so I sound like I'm not choking on my own tongue. Now I'm hiccuping. Anyway, welcome back to the Cookie Cast. Today, I think I want to talk about something just kind of completely random. I think bearing my soul may be a bit too much. And I think it's very valuable for me to do so. Like, so much of this series right now is truly, to go back 2 episodes, kind of self-care. That I think venting into, I don't want to say yelling into the wind, because I'm not, you know, this is permanently going up on the internet, well, semi-permanently, unless I decide to take it down, before an audience of potentially thousands, which is, you know, the more I think about it, the more that's kind of actually really weird to me, but not that weird. I don't know, it's fine, give me more seeds, dang it. Alright, these are mature, decays in 36 minutes. You know what? I could also just harvest them. I'm just gonna put these here. I have no idea how to actually improve cooking or farming. I want new seeds, but it's also not that important. Anyway, so today I want to talk about sci-fi versus fantasy. This is a topic that I think it's just going to be kind of random. I think it's something I'm going to revisit because I think it's kind of important for me to do so, because I think both sci-fi and fantasy are incredibly core to my identity as a person. I grew up I grew up with not a whole lot of friends, to be honest. I think this is a topic for another day, where I effectively moved around a lot and never really got the chance to forge long form personal relationships with other people. And so I think that's always been a little problematic. And so what I did as a kid was to replace them with friendships with media, video games, book series, certain TV shows and movies and whatnot. So for me growing up, it was Lord of the Rings, Redwall, Star Wars, and just a wide plethora of video games. I guess off the top of my head, Space Station, Silicon Valley, Battle Tanks, Pokemon, and like Tales of Symphonia. There's a lot of other video games. At some point I'll do a video. I think I know somebody asked me to talk about the games that I played growing up, but I think that's a video that I want to do truly on Wanderbot Prime with a visual aid, just so I can show some of them off, because not everybody's going to know what Space Station Silicon Valley looks like, to be honest. Yeah, either way. But so let's talk about sci-fi versus fantasy, because like I said, they were very core to my personality growing up, and I feel like my preferences have kind of flip-flopped back and forth for years. And it's weird, because I feel like both sci-fi and fantasy are kind of this like speculative escapism, where let's talk about and read about and be really invested in this other world, be it far future, some other dimension entirely, alternate fantasy version of our real world, or something else entirely. You know, that there's this kind of element of whimsy that goes with both that you really don't get in anything else, maybe kind of in horror movies or some other things, but I feel like sci-fi and fantasy really are just portals to other worlds, and I know that's kind of intentional. That is, for the most part, what both are, in very different directions often, but I often kind of try and noodle around the idea of being a sci-fi person or a fantasy person. I think I'm very solidly in the middle, which is really weird because there's not a lot of sci-fantasy out there. You know, it's very rare to have a sci-fi series, you know, spaceships, full space opera, but also with wizards. You get a couple of those here and there, but oftentimes the magic element is either really downplayed or really, really limited. You know, I'd point at Star Wars, for example. That's sci-fi with an ounce of fantasy. Ounce, maybe a pound of fantasy. 90% sci-fi, 10% fantasy. It kind of depends also on which Star Wars you're watching. Because there are definitely some Star Wars where it's like, whoa, boy, those Jedi are real wizards. And, you know, any Force user is like a real wizard. And then there's other ones where they're much more grounded and slow, and I mean, very much like the original trilogy, where it's mostly just a little bit of horse choking, pushing, lifting things with your mind, and then kick-ass laser sword dueling. And I think both are quite valid. But I feel like the Force was always maybe a little bit too limited, at least canonically, that it wasn't, you don't have like the full-on Merlin character that can just like sling lightning bolts from the sky for the most part. Maybe you got Palpatine who can sling lightning bolts from his fingers, but is clearly killing the guy. So there's kind of the question of like, yeah, is that really magic, or is he just burning himself out to kill someone else? I mean, I guess oftentimes you will run into magic worlds where that is also true. Sinister backfire. Uh-oh. Oh. I mean, had to happen at some point. Let's spend all of my money before we get anywhere. I just got the time machine one. Let's just buy as many of these as we can get. Alright, there we go. Dough elasticity halved. Huh. Oh, hey, we got up to factory. I have no idea what dough elasticity is. Is that this? I don't know what that does. Oh, doesn't matter. But yeah, I think for me, Star Wars was the right level of sci-fi for me, where there were hard rules, but there were many exceptions, and there was kind of this constant sense of discovery. Every time you came to a new planet, every time they put out a new media, there was always something kind of new, a new race, a new ship, a new world, a new thing, and it was kind of fun. There was always just like a newness to it. So, original Star Wars, you had Tatooine. Tatooine was a very strange place, kind of a dour and sad place, but it had a lot of intrigue and interest to it. You had the Hutts, you had, the kind of scummy spacers, you had the Jawas, which were kind of their own thing and also really cool. You had a bunch of droids. I very much remember a Star Wars game back in the day where you'd like make your own droids and you were trying to go through like a part of Tatooine ? I don't really remember why you were doing it, but I thought it was really cool. There's also pod racing, but that was in episode 4. I'm starting with episode 4 and working my way up. No. I'm talking episode 4, A New Hope. And then we'll go back to the prequels. But then episode 5, you're on Hoth. There's the war is in full swing, and you really are starting to kind of see the technological differences between both factions, the Empire and the Rebels, as well as like their tactics, their characterization, and a bunch of other things. And it was really neat seeing that. And then it kind of split off to a much more, I'm not going to say small scale conflict, but you had, Luke training on Dagobah with Yoda, and then everybody else heading for Cloud City, a little bit of political intrigue, backstabbing, stuff like that. And each one of these set pieces was new and wonderful and interesting. The idea of this city in the clouds, suspended up there, specifically to harvest the gases and also minerals from down below. And I thought that was such a cool idea. Or a swamp planet that effectively devours all. Like, that stuff is sick. And you don't see that in a lot of media to some degree. And so often with like hard sci-fi stuff, like harder sci-fi, there's no real feeling of exploration. Every planet is much the same, kind of dour and dreary and full of rules. And maybe there's like a new ship or a new race that changes the rules around a little bit. But that I think Star Wars at its best was always kind of this constant sense of discovery. That I feel like I kind of started to lose with a lot of the media post prequel trilogy, because episode 6 was, I think, a little bit more grounded. It was a big space opera battle. You did have the Ewoks, which were kind of interesting, and then you had the very beginning with how the Hutt Hutt system worked, and I thought that was neat, but slightly less adventurous than the first 2 movies. And then you got to the prequels, and then they just really started throwing everything at you. Technology was more fantastical. The races were weirder. You had the journey through the planet's core, which was effectively a Disney, like one of those enclosed, shaking vehicle rides at a theme park, but in a movie, and like really done up. I would love to go on one of those. And I mean, I guess if you go to Galaxy's Edge in Disneyland or Disney World, they effectively do put you through one of those, which is really cool, actually. I normally try to stay away from like plugging Disney, but I just sometimes they really do blow it out of the park, knock it out of the park. But then you get to episode 2, and the Clone Wars are, you know, properly going on. Things are a lot more. Well, actually, they're not. It kind of started in the course of that movie. It's been a while since I've seen episode 2, but you know, you still had new planets, new worlds, new things to constantly see. And then episode 3 really kind of had that, but not as much. It wasn't as cool. I think it was done decently well, but there was less of that feeling of discovery. And I feel like maybe it was around Clone Wars. Clone Wars, episode 2 to the episode 3, they really lost that sense of discovery, and it was much more focused on the characters and the story. And I think the most important character for that series was very much the world itself. I didn't care as much about the characters. I just wanted to see the universe developed through these characters' eyes. And the more you kind of focused it on the characters, the less you saw of the universe. And that was especially bad with the sequel trilogy, which I think they only had one scene that really felt like it was showing a new side of Star Wars, which was the completely meaningless casino scene in episode 8, and then everything else was just kind of a rehash of what already existed. I don't want to spend too much time bashing the sequel trilogy because I just didn't really like it that much. I did think the Death Star sinking into the ocean was actually really cool, and I would have loved to see more of that. I'd love to see that in like a Star Wars salvager video game where you're effectively just picking up the pieces after X conflict. I think that could be kind of cool. But beyond that, there wasn't really this feeling of exploration anymore, that, you know, they were just retreading things that had already been done, mostly because I feel like a lot of corporations, that is how they survive as a company, that it's more important for so many of them to it's more important for them to kind of retread this ground in a safe manner to guarantee profits than it really is to push things further. And I think that was one of the big issues with the sequel trilogy, and why I liked The Mandalorian so much. Because it felt like The Mandalorian, once that started coming out, there was that feeling of discovery again, that every episode was unique and interesting. And I have my grumps with that, but it felt fun and interesting again in a way that, you know, Star Wars didn't. I realize this cookie cast has just turned into me breaking down, I think, why Star Wars equally appeals to and disappoints me in a lot of ways. Let's see if we can buy up to 25. Yeah, portals. 500 trillion. Ooh, that's pricey. I gotta drink some water. But I think for the most part, just looking at Star Wars, having Dave Filoni in charge helps a lot. It really brought the fantasy back to Star Wars in a way that I needed it to be there. And if it wasn't there, then I was going to be quite disappointed and honestly just disinterested in the franchise. The video games also look like, well, I mean, I really like Jedi Fallen Order. And boy, if they could make more of those, I'd be a happy camper. Though they might not be, and I don't really know, and I'd be really sad if that was the case. So, flip side, fantasy. Some of my favorite fantasies are like Lord of the Rings, which I felt maybe was a bit too grounded. One of my biggest grumps about the whole series is the fact that Gandalf is conditionally useless. And it's like, I wanted to see more wizards as part of that, but I also realized that wizards would be able to kind of completely destroy the conflict and make things way less interesting. But it was always kind of one of those where it was really nice to see a very grounded and well-developed fantasy world. And I think it was such a good origin for fantasy for me, because I would argue, I mean, no, I definitely read and watched a lot of other fantasy stuff before Lord of the Rings, but I don't think I was really as invested in fantasy until Lord of the Rings. I specifically remember watching the animated Hobbit in like second or third grade or something like that, and then reading the books avidly over and over and over again, and also simultaneously with D&D. And I think now that I'm thinking about it, my biggest grumps with fantasy is that it's not D&D. which is weird, but like I've been an avid D&D player forever, and it feels like so many fantasy stories, even the ones that are specifically D&D centric, they're very grim. You know, you can have your fun fantasy every once in a while, but like let's go with Dragonlance as an easy example. Dragonlance is probably the most famous Dungeons and Dragons adjacent novel series, and I think they've actually burned that bridge a little bit for whatever reason. But that Dragonlance, I picked up thinking like, oh man, it's Dungeons and Dragons as like a expansive novel series and universe. It's gonna be great. And then I discovered depression, and it kind of sucked because those books are just sad. You know, they literally had a race of people that never felt fear or sadness for the most part, and then they made them terminally sad. And it's just like, I don't think you can better describe the condition of what Dragonlance was, other than that they summoned a god or they killed a god, and it made all the Kender sad. And so after that, I was just like kind of done with this series. I was already pretty done with it before that happened. And it's been so long since I've read Dragonlance that I have zero interest in really going back. But that for me, I think I'm always looking for the more kind of high-flying, fun, and boisterous high fantasy stuff. The lower the fantasy goes, the more depressing it generally is, or just the least interesting it generally is. And so, like, I really need the magic, the adventure, the discovery in both of them. Or in high and low fantasy, that, like, you need to give me that. Otherwise, I just, like, start bouncing off the series hard. So, like, I know everybody really got into Game of Thrones for a while, and I think a lot of people are regretting that. According to what I know of the final series. Or final season. But for me, I found the first, like, season or two kind of interesting, but it dragged on for so long, and it started to retread much of the similar ground, and very rarely left the confines of the pre-existing sets, except for a couple of, like, kind of neat-looking locales, but you didn't really see, like, bioluminescent forests or anything like that. Maybe they existed, maybe I missed that, but you stopped getting that fantasy sense of discovery and mystery of, like, coming to a new place, and it was just intrigue and sadness. And so I think I started bouncing off of it because there was nothing for me there. Yeah, if it didn't have the dragons, would have been historical and political. Ooh, things got orange. And I'm just relaying somewhat of what Shell is saying on the couch. But I think I agree with it a little bit that, like, you could de-fantasy Game of Thrones, and for the most part, it would be fine. You know, replace the undead hordes of the north with just Vikings. Just really angry and somewhat kind of ghoulish Vikings that just put heads on stakes or recruit people using torture or something. I don't know. There's a bunch of different ways you could do it. And then, yeah, for the most part, you could actually just really switch it over to being a proper medieval drama without any of the fantasy. Maybe it's reductive. Maybe I'd need to actually read the books to see the nuance there. But from my perspective, it didn't have that sense of discovery or whimsy or anything like that. And it was just sad. I think sometimes that's fine. Not everything needs to be pleasant and cheery and, you know, fairies and buttercups and rainbows and whatnot. But that often fantasy tends to lose sight of its own world, almost, in favor of the characters and the drama. And I think this is true of multiple types of media. But often I run into this problem with both fantasy and sci-fi, that they lose that sense of newness, especially within books and TV shows, that they ground themselves really hard, and they don't really explore their environment after maybe the first initial introduction. Mainly just because I think plots are important. But let's use this is a very poisoned example for a lot of reasons. But I'm gonna go with Harry Potter as probably one of my best examples of why this bothers me. The first, like, 3 books of Harry Potter were whimsical. Sure, there was dark things happening, and there was kind of this this long running murder mystery of like, where's Voldemort? What's he doing? What's he doing in this book? Where is he going to show up? Because it was very, I mean, every single book had some kind of Voldemort involvement. You always were trying to guess, who's the bad guy, where's the danger going to come from this time. But there was kind of this aspect of whimsy and learning. The first book was very much just like, whoa, Hogwarts, magic school, it's cool, house system, bullying, magic, magical creatures. And then second book was, I think, a little bit more dour, but there was a lot more magical creatures and even more murder mystery, which I think was quite neat. And then third book was like, oh man, let's see like more of the drama between adults and the world and the characters, and oh, you have shape changing now, and you can go to the town maybe, and there's some mystery related to like Harry's parents. And I think that was so cool. And then fourth book was just like, hey, now there's a magic tournament and also crime. And then after that, I legitimately don't even remember most of the plots of 5, 6, and 7. Was there an 8th book? No, there was an 8th movie. And realistically, this is kind of a poison example just because, at this point, I do not want to really promote J.K. Rowling in any way, shape, or form due to her anti-trans views. But I think she's a very good target for this criticism because effectively, the story got so bogged down in the plot and the character development and snogging that it lost the whimsy and the magic that actually made it so interesting originally. And it sucked because it was just like, oh man, here's this series that really knew how to explore the world initially, and then very quickly, at the midway point, threw that away and lost everything that made it special to me. And obviously, so much of this is subjective. The things that I disliked about Game of Thrones, I'm sure a lot of people absolutely adored, but I lose interest in so many of these worlds and these stories because they lose interest in themselves, that they set the stage, they build it up, and then they kind of forget to ever explore past that initial stage. I guess as an aside, and this is probably something I will do a video essay on, I'm going to say that a lot, but in my mind, a movie or a TV show is good if they change the scenes substantively at least like 5 times over the course of the movie. Not just like a different room in the house, unless there's something like really impactful going on in like a very limited location. So Night of the Living Dead style. Characters are very trapped in that one location because there's zombies outside. But, if it's a Marvel movie that doesn't really change scenes much and it's very just limited to one location, it feels odd and kind of wrong. And very limited. And so I think they've done a better job of really making every single movie and piece of media that comes out of them much more broad and expansive and really changes locations a lot and changes scenes and some other things. And so that feels better to me. And because you explore the setting more, you explore the world more, you introduce new concepts and new challenges and just things, and it keeps everything kind of moving and fun. And so I find, with so many of these series, they maybe do that for the first, half of the story, and then they stop developing that, like I said, and then they just become static. And I know it's important to like push forward towards an ending, but it's also kind of one of those where it's like, but I want to see more of that world. Because I like that window into what that world is like. And that's, once again, I think part of the reason why Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and Redwall were so successful, because they showed so much more of the world than just the set pieces that the characters were standing in. And so that's kind of where I like disconnect with both, and why I kind of hope to see more like that. I feel like video games do a good job of this, and maybe part of the reason why I'm so much more into video games than I'm into sci-fi movies and TV shows and books. Books tend to be maybe a little bit better, but in a video game, if you're locked to one environment for, 5 hours, people are going to be like, this is boring. it's the same tile set. I don't like this anymore. And will actively, you know, say like, hey, developers, you need to add more to this. And so Halo is a good example of a game that I think does it well. You spend a lot of time, you know, just driving around, but sometimes you're also walking around outside, inside ships, interacting with different locations, and then all of a sudden they throw you for a loop and throw you into kind of a undead horror temple, and it's just like, oh shit, things are on fire. And they even revisited a couple of locations and like really changed things around, and it just it felt like it was a very good use of space. That even though the game isn't actually that long, it really did feel like a journey that you went on, and I found that to be quite satisfying. The original Half-Life and Half-Life 2, I think, also did it quite well. That you had kind of the initial labs, and then outdoors a little bit more with military people. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. It's been a while since I've played OG Half-Life, but then eventually you're in an alien dimension. And then in Half-Life 2, you're kind of out in the boonies, or no, you're in the city, then you're out in the boonies for a while, kind of doing this and that, and then you eventually go back to the city in a much more substantive and meaningful way. And that kind of feeling of journey and showing what the world is like around you as you pass through it. The environmental storytelling becomes quite important, and draws me in as a viewer and a consumer so much more. And I also feel like so many video games really do the interchange between sci-fi and fantasy better. You know, one of my favorite JRPGs, and I think the mystique of it has maybe dropped off a little bit over the years, but I really loved Xenoblade Chronicles. I thought it was an absolutely wonderful series. It was a great mix of sci-fi and fantasy. You kind of had nanite magic, and you had these, I mean, the whole world setting concept was great. You're on these two giant titans. You know, one's a giant mecha and the other's kind of a kaiju thing, but not really, but they're dead. And people just live on them, which is just weird and cool. And I thought that was such a lovely idea, as far as, ooh, this is a big boost. Such a lovely idea as far as like building a world and really fleshing it out as something fascinating. And I have destroyed where my glasses are. Okay, there we go. And so I really appreciated the sci-fantasy fusion there in a way that I haven't seen in a whole lot of other things. And I want to say anime games do the whole sci-fantasy fusion maybe a little bit better. I'm also thinking of like Tales of Symphonia. You know, by the time you get to the final levels, the whole game has just gone full sci-fi in a weird way. Or Final Fantasy's Magitech reliance, I think, has always been kind of interesting, and it varies on a game-by-game basis. You know, you straight up start Final Fantasy VI in mech suits, going around this steampunk town. That was such a unique setting, and it really drew me in, and it never really developed on, I think, the technology as much as I wish they had. You know, they had the roving castle, and they had a bunch of, like, industry and mecha stuff, but I was really hoping for, like, more sci-fi fantasy bits here and there. And then you get to Final Fantasy VII, and you've got all of Midgar that's just this, like, sci-fi technical marvel, but the whole world is kind of this weird near future / modern / little bit of fantasy fusion. And it was just so cool exploring that world through the lens of the character's eyes. Do I want to get this? How much are ships worth? 255 trillion to get that is not that big. Whereas, like, going for the portal boost would be big, but cost a lot. I might want to wait for it all the same. There's also the time machine one, but that's 700 trillion. There's also, let's see, anything else? I mean, there's the mouse. I don't know. I'll think about these. But that, I think Final Fantasy always did a really good job of fusing both technology and magic in a way that made sense and had this kind of feeling of whimsy and interest. I think I always beat myself up a little bit for not playing more of them. I've only ever finished Final Fantasy X. I literally have only finished that one. Technically, I finished Final Fantasy VII-R and never I haven't done the Yuffie DLC. I did a little bit of it, and people didn't want to watch it. I was like, no, I wanted to play more of this. And I probably will someday, just say, like, screw it, whatever, I'll just play it anyway. Just for funsies. But I mean, even Final Fantasy X had some really interesting crosses between technology and magic. And maybe even in some of the most unique expression of that out of all of the Final Fantasy games. I should probably also play, like, 12. I think that's part of the reason why I bounced off of 15. Because they had a little bit more sci-fi, but the world itself was kind of boring modern. Not fully boring modern, but it was just kind of like, I wanted to see a more a more truly sci-fi Final Fantasy. And I'm a little disappointed that that hasn't really happened yet. At least not as far as the mainline series goes that I can think of. Oh wait, no, never mind. That's Final Fantasy 13. I should play that at some point. I just know the characters. Everybody always hates on the characters, and I'm like, nah, but maybe it could? I don't know. I think I just need to start playing these games for myself. But I'm a little disappointed to see that Final Fantasy 16 is really moving to the pure fantasy. At least it looks pretty pure fantasy, but I also know it's being produced by the director of Final Fantasy 14, I think. And, I mean, he did such a good job with Final Fantasy 14 that I don't really have a whole lot of complaints. But I think I want to see more games kind of push the envelope of the sci-fi fantasy fusion than really pushing in either direction. Though I'd like to see both mediums pushed further. Because I think it's so much more interesting than real-life stuff. You know, if I want to think about modern military shooters, I just read a history book. I know that's a bit reductive, but it's just like, my favorite battlefield is Battlefield 2142. Fighting on that giant helicarrier was the coolest shit ever, and after that, no interest in any other Battlefield game, because it couldn't top it. And so I'm really hoping at some point they figure out that, like, hey, people liked that, and go back to it. I think what I should do is actually just play on a private server every once in a while. You know, take a bunch of fans with me and just make a day of it, because I think that'd be really cool. I don't know. I think that's it. I realized that I didn't do for this video. I didn't really talk about sci-fi versus fantasy in this, because I don't think it's really worth comparing and contrasting them in any kind of like one is better than the other. If anything, I'd actually say that they're very similar. They're two sides of the same coin, and they're often subjected to the same limitations and issues as each other. Obviously, fantasy is a little bit more grounded, so you can have it be a bit more location-based, in sci-fi, because most sci-fi is interplanetary and even interstellar. You can kind of lose connection to the locations that you're in. You can just like, oh, we need a lava planet. Let's go to the lava planet. Oh, we need the desert planet, but it's a different one from the other desert planet. And you just kind of lose connection to that. Because it's like, yeah, what is the difference between Rey's home planet and Tatooine? And the answer is Star Destroyers crashed into it, I guess. But other than that, I mean, it might as well be the same planet. I have issues with the sequel trilogy, but that can be a separate video entirely. I got more to say there. But that I feel like trying to push the envelope either on sci-fi and fantasy, or I think fusing them with other genres helps a lot. You know, I really want to see more steampunk fantasy, because I don't think there's enough of that. I also don't think there's like enough druid magic fantasy. You know, like, you don't see a whole lot of eco-punk, green punk fantasy, or green punk / solar punk sci-fi. Most sci-fi nowadays is very kind of just regular hard sci-fi space opera stuff, or like, I mean, very Mass Effect-y is usually how it goes, or just corporate dystopia futuristic, which sucks. I don't like that. I realize it's in vogue, and it really does feed into the cultural fear of falling into a dystopic corporate hell, but at the same time, it's kind of one of those where it's exhausting, staring a doomed future in the face. And I really want to see more like uplifting sci-fi stuff, where it's just like you're excited to see the world. You know, I was never excited to see any of the aspects of, say, Cyberpunk 2077. Playing that game was just a litany of depressing situations, one after the next. And it was not very fun to confront that. And so I want to see more that like really pushes the whimsy and the hope and the fun. And I need to go back and play Mass Effect Andromeda at some point. I know that game had its flaws. Same thing with Anthem. But I will at least say both of those kind of showed this alternate interesting future that I know Anthem was a little sad, but it at least had kind of that whimsy to it. And same thing with Mass Effect Andromeda, that it's like you're exploring, you're seeing something cool and interesting, and really trying to see as much of this almost weirdly idealistic future as possible. And I need more media like that in my life and just in general, and with like the more fun tone, even with fantasy and sci-fi books and whatnot. You know, I'm not really interested in these like really grimdark stories. Like I really want to read Worm at some point, but I don't actually really want to read Worm because I feel like I'd just be kind of sad and not terribly interested in what's going on, even though I'm sure it's interesting and great. Okay, what is my... where I can check. No, that's info. Stats. These are achievements. Damn it. I really wish I knew how much I get per click. Just about 1 billion. Whereas I think this is going to be worth more. Yeah, let's go with that. Yeah, that's worth it. I think that was worth it. I could be wrong. I don't know. We also probably want to get time machines up to 15 and go from there. Anyway, I guess before I go, I usually don't ask for this sort of thing, but on the topic of finding, you know, interesting sci-fi and fantasy stuff that I think is a little bit more uplifting and interesting and exciting, I would love to hear some suggestions in that regard. What are some video games and television shows and books that take sci-fi and fantasy in a more like from a more fun angle than anything? I guess most recently the show that actually really did it for me, Baker's Wheat. It's sprouting, maturing in about 7 minutes. Oh no. Well, I mean, that's fine. I'll just grab it in a bit. Oh, wait, no, it's Baker's Wheat. I'm not interested in Baker's Wheat. I have Baker's Wheat. I need new seeds. I just saw it pop up and I'm like, oh, maybe new thing. But the answer is no. Possible mutations. A bunch. Maybe. Anyway, so the most recent fantasy thing that like really drew me in as like kind of a equally dark at times, but nice and whimsical and fun series. I got really into BNA, which I thought was like a really neat modern fantasy, admittedly with furries, but like who cares, whatever. I'm not interested in the whole like furry bashing thing for this. I thought it was a fun series, and it was kind of like, you know, I could actually see where people are coming from with this all of a sudden. But the other one is Owl House, which I just absolutely adore. I think that is probably some of the best television and not sci-fi, some of the best fantasy I've seen in forever. I think it was everything I wanted out of Adventure Time, but I liked the characters better. I always had trouble connecting to Finn and Jake. They felt more like murder hobos, and Luce in Owl House is just like so much easier for me to connect to as a character, and just more fun to root for instead. Instead, I guess was part of it. I don't know. And so I would love to hear some suggestions for more media like that. Just so I can surround myself with some more fun things again. Because it feels like oftentimes when I'm watching a television show or a movie, it's just sad. And video games too, but less so. And I think it's easier to have fun with it because, you know, if the gameplay is fun, who cares? Dark Souls, depressing as shit. Fun game though. And so it's kind of easy to not be affected by it in the same way. Anyway, so hopefully I see a couple of suggestions in there. But for now at least, I'm losing my voice. So I will see you guys on the next episode of the Cookie Cast. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. I guess I'm repeating myself. Oh well.